What contributes to comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is being considered as the basis of international trade. That means international trade will be governed by comparative advantage or comparative differences in cost. That means a nation will export the commodity on which it has comparative advantage, and the same nation will import the commodity on which the nation doesn't have any comparative advantage. So to speak, comparative advantage will be measured by comparative differences in cost. What contributes to comparative advantage, or what contributes to comparative differences in cost? There are a few factors affecting the comparative advantage of a nation on producing the commodity. The first one is opportunity cost, which was put forward by Haberler in 1936. So on the basis of opportunity cost, the comparative advantage can be measured. What does opportunity cost mean in the international trade scenario? Opportunity cost is not the real cost, or it is not the cost actually incurred by the nation. This is the cost. This is considered as the cost of a commodity that must be given up to produce another commodity. So if after specialization, if a nation produces only one commodity, then that commodity's opportunity cost is the cost of the commodity that was given up to produce the next commodity. So whenever the opportunity cost is higher on a commodity, that commodity will be imported. That means the specialization by the nation will be on other commodity. If the cost of opportunity cost is lower on a commodity, then that commodity will be exported. So the nation will specialize in the production of that commodity, and the nation will export that commodity. So the international trade is driven by comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is measured by opportunity cost. So the nation will export the commodity on which it has less opportunity cost, and the nation will import the commodity on which it has higher opportunity cost. So the first factor contributing to comparative advantage is opportunity cost. Second one in our list is factor proportions. Factor proportions and factor abundance. If a nation is labor abundant, then the labor will be cheaper in that nation, capital will be short in that nation, wage rate will be lower, but the price of capital will be higher. That means interest rate will be higher. So the nation will have the comparative advantage on labor intensive commodity. Similarly, a nation with capital abundance, where capital is cheaper, labor is costlier, laborers price wage rate will be higher, so that nation will have the comparative advantage on capital intensive commodity. For example, as India as a labor surplus nation has comparative advantage on textile commodities, and so India can specialize in textile commodities on which abundant laborers are employed in the sector. Similarly, United States as a capital surplus nation can specialize in the capital intensive commodity like aircraft manufacturing. So the United States has capital abundance, the price of capital will be cheaper there, so they can specialize in capital intensive commodity like aircraft manufacturing. So the comparative advantage is measured by factor proportions or capital factor abundance. So if a nation has higher capital labor ratio, that means the use of capital is higher. That nation will be a capital abundant nation, so they can concentrate on capital intensive commodities. Similarly, when capital labor ratio is lower for some nations, then those nations can concentrate on labor intensive commodities. Another factor contributing to the comparative advantage of a nation is technological innovations and imitations. So these two has to be talked together: technological innovations and imitations. What is how do the technological innovations and imitations contribute to the comparative advantage of the nations? Whenever the nation invents something, that a nation will be able to produce the commodity with best effective technology. So the nation can produce the commodity at cheaper price, so they can dominate the international trade global sector with effective production technique. So the technological innovation will enable a nation to dominate the international trade. So that technological innovation will be followed by imitations after a fixed period, a certain period of time. So some other nations will imitate the newly invented technology. So usually technological innovations will happen originally in developed nations, which will be capital abundant, but so their labor cost will be still costly, but after a period of time, depends on the patent and copyright matters, some other nations, developing nations, which will be labor abundant nations, will imitate the technology, and they will be able to produce the commodity at even lesser prices, because they have their labor cost is even cheaper, so they can export the commodity after certain period of time. So capital comparative advantage will be contributed by technological innovations, and after that imitations of that technology. Another factor contributing to the comparative advantage of a nation is economies of scale. So what is economies of scale? Economies of scale is the advantage of the large scale production, that is the falling average cost with production process. So as the production increases, average cost will be coming down. So this was explained by the increasing returns to scale. So this increasing returns to scale has been completely neglected by the trade theories, but economies of scale is a reality in the modern day trade. So economies of scale will enable the nation to dominate the international trade sector. So our last point is transportation cost. Transportation cost is an inevitable cost in the modern day trade, but it was completely neglected by the trade theories. But transportation cost is a reality, and it has to be taken into account while defining the basis of international trade. So whenever the nation is able to supply the commodities across the international borders with less transportation cost, so that nation will have usually the comparative advantage. But whenever the nation is not able to supply, not able to export the commodities at a less price, so that nation normally cannot have the comparative advantage. So this is one of the factors contributing to the comparative advantage, but this is not a final word for the factors affecting comparative advantage, because India exports immensely to United States, and India and United States have been the major trade partners. Similarly, China and US, they also have been major trade partners. China has been exporting the commodities to United States. So transportation cost is not the only factor, it is one of the factors. Anyhow, let us brief the lesson. Comparative advantage has been considered as a basis of international trade. So this is an undisputed point. Comparative advantage is considered as the basis of international trade. So what determines the basis of what determines the comparative advantage is the question. Comparative advantage is determined by so many factors, as we discussed in the previous slides. Comparative advantage will be determined by the opportunity cost. Comparative advantage will be determined by economies of scale. Comparative advantage will be determined by factor abundance. Comparative advantage will be determined by innovation and imitation. Comparative advantage will be determined by transportation cost. Thank you.